So our next speaker to lead off we got Dr. David Newman. David is Senior Vice President of Market Growth at the National Pork Board. That means he's responsible for some of your checkoff dollars, all right? So I'm expecting some good questions to hold him accountable with that. He oversees National Pork Board's work in domestic and international market development, multicultural, and human nutrition. David has worked extensively throughout the pork industry, including production, academia, and consulting. He holds a PhD in meat science and animal science from North Dakota and a bachelor's in animal science from the University of Missouri with a minor in international agriculture.
Oh, yeah. Good morning.
That was the deal.
We'll back that all the way up. Just go here and just keep clicking back. There you go. Keep going. I've never done it in reverse, but we can try if you want. So
you're live. Okay.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So first off, thank you for the introduction. I called Al Wolfcool yesterday. I was giving a talk in Columbus, Ohio yesterday at the Reciprocal Meats Conference, and I called Al and I said, "Hey, Al, you invited me to come speak today, so I'm really looking forward. You want to catch up for lunch?" And he called me last night and said, "I'm on vacation in upstate New York, so good luck with your talk tomorrow." So it is an honor to be here and to represent the work that we're doing. A little bit about myself. So the introduction, David Newman. I've been at National Pork Board now for 2 years leading the market growth team, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and what that means. So basically, the way that I summarize this is really thinking about how does National Pork Board play a role in the global market growth strategy. So once we get market access into an international market, think about Mexico right now being our biggest partner, or emerging markets like the Philippines or somewhere else. What do we do there? But for the last, especially 2 years, since I came on to this role in June of 2023, which Brady pointed out was not a real bright spot in the hog market at that time, we really started to think more about this domestic demand piece, which is what I'm going to talk more specifically about. So I grew up in the hog business. My parents were hog farmers. We still own a hog operation in Missouri. A little fun fact about me is I was actually born in Pocahontas, Iowa. So my family was in the hog business up in northwest Iowa for about 20 years. And then moved back to where they were from in southern Missouri. And my dad begged me to go to Iowa State because we still owned some property in Iowa, and he was going to make this thing work. You know, he begged me. But of course, the more your dad begs you to do something, the more I was looking for other options. So sorry, great program. I went to the University of Missouri, as pointed out, did an undergrad in animal science and in international agriculture as well, and then moved on to North Dakota State University in Fargo, and that's where I completed a PhD in meat science. So not a veterinarian, not an economist, I'm just a really overeducated butcher, is what I tell people most of the time. But the great part about being a meat scientist, I always say, is that throughout my career, I worked in the meat science crew. I also worked with Gary Ali, who was a very prominent swine nutritionist. You may know I worked in Gary's lab at the University of Missouri. I took my econ classes with Ron Plain, who you guys remember very well in this business. And so try to take all of that experience from the production level that I grew up in, from having a basic understanding of genetics, nutrition, strategies to save money, welfare, environment, sustainability, and then ultimately at the end of the day, tie my passion into, when I went to Mizzou, I thought I was going to be a veterinarian because that's what people do, and they want to get into animal science. And then I learned about this thing around meat, and I just became fascinated because I say this all the time on stage or anywhere else to anyone who will listen to me, and I say, this entire business, agriculture, and the pork business specifically, revolves around one theory, and that is that a consumer walks into a retail grocery store or a food service operation, they order pork, they buy it, and they like it enough to order it another time. And if that doesn't happen billions and billions and billions of times over every year, no matter what sector of the business we're in, it doesn't exist, right? So this focus on the consumer is a really big piece, and I think that, I'm not sure what direction I have to point here. You may or may not have heard that we just launched a new brand campaign. And this is new because we haven't, and when I say we, the National Pork Board of the national pork industry, you, the 66,000 farmers we represent, have not had a national branded campaign in about a decade. Essentially since late 2015, we've done a lot of very strategic one-off approaches, but not a large national approach like what we're doing now with this Taste What Pork Can Do campaign. And so what I'm going to do today is just walk you through a little bit of how we got here, and then more importantly, where I believe we're going next. And I think this is really important. And it's exciting for me because for the last 2 years, we've been working with our board of directors. We've been out talking to producers and saying, hey, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do. And at some point, that drives a lot of fatigue, right? Because what do you think the number one question that I got, or that I get more often than anything is, what the hell is the National Pork Board doing with my money, right? So that's the question I get very frequently. What are we doing about demand? And so the board of directors that represent you and that represent your checkoff dollars, when I put this up, I really say, this has been your demand from the business for the last 24 months. No matter what producer survey it was, no matter what state association meeting we were at, no matter what we did at our National Pork Industry Forum, demand has come to the top of the list every single time. And so recognizing that we have numerous other areas that have a significant amount of importance, whether that is swine health, right? We all know what the potential impact of a foreign animal disease could be, but more importantly, what endemic disease has done with PRRS this year, and a lot of that has been discussed this morning, and I'm sure will be discussed this afternoon. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, this is really how I look at it. And if you really think about this, it's a statement of saying, why does marketing matter? That's the first question you should ask yourself. And the second thing is, and this is really important, is what is our role in this piece of marketing, knowing that there are hundreds, if not more, of other brands, both domestically and internationally, that represent individual one-off entities, right? And we all know them, and I'm gonna give a few examples of some of those later, not including everyone. So I break this down and go, when you're thinking about how do we get rid of 28 billion pounds of product a year, because that's basically what our total production is, how does that break down to an international versus domestic push? So 28 billion pounds is a lot. And for those of you who have been involved in any form of marketing before, it's a really interesting business if you think about processing 10,000 hogs a day. That's 20,000 hams, 20,000 loins, 40,000 feet, 20,000 bellies, right? Butts, picnics, shanks, all these really hard things, ground pork, bones. What do we do with all this product? Offal, think about what's happening in China right now. Thinking about offal and the products and the value that that drives for our business is critically important. But at the end of the day, I usually say pretty simply is, no matter what business you're in, if you're in manufacturing, if you're selling technology, something else, if you're not marketing the only thing you make, then you're probably going to be somewhat limited on the potential that you have to move forward into the future and think about that generational transformation, if you will. And so breaking this down and just thinking about this a little bit, we export about 8 billion pounds of product a year. And so I think the really important thing, and fundamentally to make a good comparison, is that for the last 25 or 30 years, we have been on an incredible growth trajectory in international marketing. You all know that if you've read anything in the pork business, and any of you who've been involved in commodity boards or something else, then you have heard something about the value of the Japanese market, the value of the Korean market, the value of Central South America, Mexico, right? I mean, I remember in the previous administration, right, when they were talking about building this wall across Mexico, U.S. border, right? They said they could build a wall as long as they leave a hole in it big enough to throw a hand through, right? And that business is growing exponentially. But, and there's a but here, the game is changing. For 25 years, we have put an incredible amount of focus on the international market using that brand right there, that American flag pig that's on my coat that I give away on airplanes almost every single day when I'm traveling. When people go, is that a pig? That's really cool. And I literally will wear a little spot out in my jacket. That is the licensed logo for international marketing that's managed by the National Pork Board. So literally, to use that with our partner, U.S. Meat Export Federation in Korea, Japan, Mexico, any of those trading partners I talked about, we license the use of that logo in country. And in country, we do very specific marketing and programmatic activities. So if it's in Japan, if you've been to Japan and you know pork, they're very big into these characters, right? These more cartoony things like Hello Kitty or whatever. And the feature there is gochipo. Anybody ever seen gochipo in Japan? It's very successful and related to the U.S. pork business, but you go to Mexico and it's something like pure pork. So it just depends in the price-driven markets versus the markets that are more quality-driven or more mature. But the game is changing, and this is the but piece of this, is that for the last 25 years, not only we had that huge exponential growth, it's taken us to about 30% of our total production, but the next step is that we are no longer the least cost producer. And that's a big awareness kind of aha moment that we're having right now, I think, for forecasting where exports are going to go for the next 5 or 10 years. So we're at 30%. I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did, right? But if you look at a lot of the analysis that's done by economists or by the U.S. Meat Export Federation, led by Dan Hallstrom, they say that's probably going to remain somewhat flat through that very similar time period that Matt outlined in his talk earlier, which was really, really good. So while we're going to see that potential growth in efficiency and growth in production and everything else, it's going to really depend on what's happening in geopolitics and what's happening with the rest of the world on where we get market access. And it's going to look different than it looked for the last 30 years. That's the awareness point that I have that kind of keeps me up at night, if you will, whenever I was thinking about the fact that we weren't putting as much emphasis on that 20 billion pounds of product that we're moving at home under this Taste What Pork Can Do brand, along with the rest of our industry partners. So, especially related to Matt's conversation and his slides, which I was taking pictures of and thinking about that PSY number, right, and thinking about what it's going to be like. That forecasted number, if I did the math right, is somewhere a little over 5,000 pounds per sow per year increase by 2035. If that growth is a split out, I'd love to know, like, where are we going to look like in 2035 from an export versus domestic standpoint? But no matter what, you cannot excuse the consumption of 20 billion pounds of product. Because whenever I came on board at the Pork Board, I said, well, here's the thing. This has been the historical roller coaster. I've ridden that roller coaster with my own family for, my son will be 4 generations in this business. And we all know those horror stories of 1998, right? We know the highs, we know the lows, we know what happened when we had disease outbreaks and all these other components. But at the end of the day, if we take into account what is really going to drive this thing moving forward, we're going to have to take a really hard look in the mirror and make sure that we understand that our consumers have more choices than they have ever had in the history, and that just putting pork on sale, this is an important statement, just pulling the price lever to move more product doesn't actually work that well. And it's different for everybody. It's different for food service, different for retailers, right? But at the end of the day, the 66,000 pig farmers that I work for, what I want to see them do is be profitable. And the way to be profitable is not to push product through the market by just putting it on sale, because in 2023, pork became cheaper than chicken. So if it's a race to the bottom, you're going to lose, right? If this is about comparing our efficiency to the efficiency of a broiler or something else, we've got to think about this differently. And I say unapologetically, because pork is amazing, right? It's nutritious, it's delicious. We have bacon, thank God. right? We have all these products that we can celebrate, and we don't need to compare ourselves to the other proteins. We need to celebrate what matters the most. Now, what can we, and this we here is National Pork Board, we certainly can't impact supply, because as a producer or the animal scientist in me, I definitely ask a lot of questions in my head to say, so we make more pigs per year, we make more pounds per year, right? What does that mean for sow numbers? What does that mean for the size and scale of the business? And those are all things that certainly I can't answer, and it's really up to the industry to decide how we end up doing that. So we can't impact supply, but we certainly can work with the broader industry to impact demand. And simply put, it's not about a push strategy, it's about a pull strategy. And this isn't the first time we've been here. And so I would imagine one of the questions is going to be is, you back this up to 1985. This is the 40th year anniversary of the National Pork Checkoff System. So you have pork checkoff, beef checkoff, corn checkoff, soy checkoff. There's even a checkoff for the Concrete Block Association. So I cannot imagine how riveting those speeches are, but we're not the only one out there. So in 40 years, what have we done? We've come a long ways, right? Not here to debate that, but in 1987, you all remember that one. 2 years into the checkoff, the launch of the Other White Meat brand campaign, right? Everybody in the world, almost literally, has heard of that brand campaign at some point in time. But that's no longer our brand campaign. And I'm going to show you kind of a fun video, because part of this is about having fun, because I think it's about having an unapologetic position for pork, and I think that we also need something to rally behind. Honestly, I think we need something to get excited about. We have to talk about disease, we have to talk about all these other things, but it is really fun to talk about pork. And you come off of Expo, or you go into Iowa State Fair or anywhere else, and there's a lot of pork going around, and there's a lot of consumers that love it. And the good news is, if you look at the demographics of the population of the United States, culturally speaking, the growth in this country for the next 30 years at least is going to be a population of individuals who come from countries where pork is still the #1 protein, right? So there is a lot to celebrate, and the decline, as I say quite often, is reversible. So we've had the Other White Meat, we've had Be Inspired, we've had this push on multicultural marketing. That's what I'm lending to in the conversation right now. So Hispanic, African American, Asian, huge pushes for the pork business. But I threw this line in here this morning, actually, so I had to upload my slides again. I put this line in here to say, yeah, okay, you guys have been here, you've done promotion, you've done marketing, but what is different this time? And I think that's a very valid question. And something that happened in that red line area there around 2021 and 2023 was really the Pork Board taking a step back and saying, we're not going to rely on other people for our information and our data and our business intelligence. And so in that time frame where that red line was drawn, you see those words, insights to action. We developed an entire team of individuals dedicated to business intelligence. That's purchasing data from numerous resources. It's also utilizing the same economic resources that every one of you use every day to look at the markets, look what's moving the markets, but also to think very specifically about what is driving the future consumer of pork. That's a really important statement, the future consumer of pork, because I promise you that if you think about what the future consumer looks like, I say this quite often, we don't raise hogs the way we raised them 40 years ago, for sure, and our consumer looks radically different than they did 40 years ago. What motivates them, what food trends, how much they eat, portion size, center of plate, which by the way, Gen Zs, millennials, those are the people we need to grab. It's not a center cut pork chop with mashed potatoes on one side and green beans on the other if it's me. And maybe fried potatoes and okra too, I don't know. I've had plenty of that, obviously, right? So when we think about those traditional meals, that's not what drives the future consumer. So we busted into this consumer segmentation work, which any marketing agency would do. Any company trying to sell a new product is going to say, segment my consumer out and tell me who am I marketing to and why. And what is driving them? And you know, right? These people are probably posting something for their Instagram, right? Which we're now on Instagram friends, by the way. So when we think about this and we think about how that consumer is, the reality is what's really different. One is we're driving the business intelligence on our own in partnership with other agency partners. But the other thing is that we're taking an entirely different look at the market. And by segmenting those consumers, it tells us where we need to act and respond and where we don't need to act and respond. In the 1980s and the 1990s, and you think about the other white meat or pork be inspired or those other brands, which, by the way, did help sell pork. If you look at a return on an analysis, which we have to do every 5 years at the pork board, any time you do promotion, it works. Okay, any product you're making, if you promote it, it typically can work, but it's not a shotgun approach to the market anymore. It's a very specific and very focused, targeted approach to individual markets, and I'm going to showcase that to you here in just a minute. But when you break out the segments, and I keep showing this slide over and over again, also a marketing thing, right? If you're going to digitally market to someone, they need to see something at least 10 times, right, before it starts sinking in. It's why you get hit so frequently of ads every time you open your social media about, you ever notice this? Only the things you like or the things you've been discussing. And that's intentional. I use Facebook Marketplace, which, by the way, is the savior for Meta because young people don't use Facebook. The savior for Meta, at least in Meta's segmentation analysis, says young people don't use Facebook. They use Snapchat, they use Instagram, right? But they all use Facebook Marketplace. And if you ever notice when you open, how many of you guys have Facebook Marketplace? Raise your hands. You ever notice when you open it, it's only the things you like to buy? That's not on accident. That's because your phone is listening to you, right? And this digital space we live in, as scary as it is, and especially when you think about artificial intelligence, we know a lot about the consumer today. We know where they live, if they went to college or not, how many kids they have in their house, how much money they make, where they shop, when they shop, what they like to buy the most, and that can get all the way down to a protein level. But then most importantly, do they actually purchase it? And somebody said this earlier. I don't remember if it was Brady or Matt. They were talking about the say-do gap. The say-do gap. Do consumers actually do what they say they do? And a lot of the time the answer is no. But one undeniable thing is whenever they run that across a scanner and they pay for it. And so when you can do digital marketing today and add to cart, you guys do that with Instacart, with all these, every time you add to cart and you're actually purchasing, that is funneling data to someone in the world who's trying to sell something that you like. And that's a totally different approach, not necessarily just because the pork board is different, by the way, it's just because we're all learning to adapt to new technologies, which you have to do if you're going to survive moving forward. But if you look at this from right to left, right is the older generation, the silent generation, right? Look at the fresh pork consumption. This is not total pork. This is fresh pork consumption. You'll see here, the boomer generation, right, has carried this business for a very long time. And when you think about their children and their children's children, sliding down here to Gen Z, there's not a home for the product we're going to produce. There's not a home for that without giving it away nearly, if that is truly the trend that keeps happening with fresh or processed pork in this country. Right? So when we think about the long-term trajectory, the fact that they have more options than they've ever had before, this is really fundamental, and one slide that I use really drastically to say, how do we start to change that? Because the focus, while it is still very important for the boomer generation, who, by the way, is no matter what, still eating a significant amount of product, but eating significantly less. You know, and it doesn't matter what protein you look at, the data is the same, by the way. Husband and wife, kids are gone from home, right? They're even more than likely graduated from college and have their own family. They used to eat 2 ribeyes, now they split one. Or they cut it in fourths and eat it for 2 days. That's not a long-term strategy. right? Their kids who have kids, that's the people we're trying to focus on. But also not just changing their purchasing habits, but changing their mentality. Changing their mentality away from, what do you want to eat? And what do you think most kids say when you ask them, what do you want to eat for your meat? Because you don't have an option in my house. What do you want to eat? What do you think most kids say? Okay, well, there you go. There's a problem, right? Where do you want to go out to eat fast food? Where do you want to go out and buy coffee? Exactly. You think that was not on accident, right? That's the power of marketing, but more importantly, it's the power of relevance. And I say, like, there is an opportunity to reverse that relevant factor, because relevance is the most important word we've got. And when I think about this, there's some fundamental things. I mentioned this cultural approach to the future population of this country, which, by the way, is going to be a huge population of Latinos. It's going to be a huge population of African American and Asian. And if you look at the data around the world, and this is a little questionable at the moment, depending on which data set you look at. If you look at USDA's website and the FAO, they say poultry is still curbing, or pork is still curbing out poultry by about 2%. If you look at other data sets, it says that chicken may be outpacing us by a couple of percentage points. I think that's probably more to the point that Brady brought up earlier, that ASF skipped a generational gap in China. Pork was just too expensive, right? And they went to an alternative protein. And so what they're trying to figure out a generational gap there, where it used to be pork, but they bought things that were affordable. And so that is starting to shift the demand curve globally a little bit, but still pork is incredibly relevant. And the tonnage that we are sending around the world, not only outside of the US, but the tonnage that we're producing domestically is just astronomical, right? So there's a heck of a good opportunity if we meet the consumer where they are. And I spoke yesterday at this Reciprocal Meats Conference, and I sat next to the head fresh meat buyer from Kroger. And we were sitting there talking, and we started talking about, meeting the consumer where they are, meeting them where they are. And I said, well, we do have to meet the consumer where they are, but by and large, the meat case in the pork set doesn't look any different than it looked 40 years ago. What are we going to do about that? And it really doesn't. I used to do a ton of retail research whenever I was in academia, as a meat scientist, and will tell you that we still pretty much fabricate pigs the same way, right? We do make a lot of unique and innovative products, but we still have a lot to learn about potentially tiered programs or specialty products, right? Because what is driving that future consumer is in that middle box. Gen Zs and millennials, they're driven by one thing first and foremost: taste and flavor. Taste and flavor. That's across everything, right? If it doesn't taste good and it sucks, they're out. They're not going to eat it again. That's very important, and that's across everything. Second is balance and nutrition. Is this good for me? Is this good for my family? There's an interesting story, and there's a really positive story here all at the same time. The positive story is that protein is having a moment with Gen Zs and millennials. Every package you pick up says 20 grams of protein, 18 grams of protein, 10 grams of protein. And by the way, we were all scared of fake meat back in 2019, like, oh my God, fake meat's gonna take over the world. No, it's not. They sent all that stuff back to the freezer because the repeat purchase rate was abysmal. And you know why? Because it sucked, right? It's awful. If you've ever eaten it, it's terrible. And people don't eat things that are terrible, right? So I do find the interesting story to say that, look at these coffee drinks out here today, And we say, like, man, people are really worried about nutrition and everything else. And I go, but your average coffee drink is like more than 800 calories by the time we put all the sugar and the milk and everything else in it. So it has to taste good, and it has to drive the consumer. But taste and flavor, balance and nutrition, that's why we have a very specific nutrition team at the National Pork Board. That's really important for a couple of reasons. One, we've got to break the cycle with registered dietitians and doctors who are wrong, okay? Who ask you, how much red meat do you eat? Before they ask you, how much sugar do you consume, which is a problem. But then more importantly, and we all know this, and I'm not here to talk about the MAHA movement, but without sound fundamental research that we're doing right now, you can't influence the dietary guidelines. And it can't be gut. It has to be sound research about protein. It has to be sound research about fat and the role that it plays in the diet. And I think that all of that lends to pork as a nutritional superfood. And especially when you compare it to other proteins, by the way. And particularly, I got to be fair here, when you compare it to red versus white meat, because pork is a red meat. Remember that marketing thing earlier? Huh? Pork is a red meat. Pay attention when you watch the video here in a minute. Because when you think about pork, I told somebody, some students night before last, they were asking me about this nutrition thing. And it's like, I'm like, you know, not to make a bad analogy in the news, but I'm like, you know, pork is like a small nuclear weapon of nutrition. Because if you're going to be growing, if you have a pregnant woman, if you have a young child, or even if you have someone who is more senior in age, and you look at protein, you look at iron, you look at zinc, you look at niacin, you look at vitamin B6, vitamin B12, all the things that are essential for fundamental growth and even brain development and cognitive ability, red meat is packed full of it. And to match that with white meat and supplements takes an incredible amount when we are an affordable, not cheap, but an affordable protein that is packed full of nutrition. And I think that eventually the science is debunking that myth. But getting those people to understand that is like one of the hardest things to do, and it's a huge challenge. So we identified in our segmentation that nutrition is critical, and then how are we going to go after nutrition next? And then the last thing, which doesn't surprise anybody, is convenience and versatility. I mean, I have a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, and I know for a fact that I was not as busy when I was 10 as my 10-year-old is. The kids have a busier schedule than their parents. All the moms in here are like, yeah, tell me about it, right? And what do you need when you go home? Meals in minutes, right? You need something quick. You need something that's easy. We haven't always met the quick and easy category. So I think in a great example of that right here in Iowa, call one person out. Pat, your group, the promotion at Iowa, has done a lot of work with C-stores, like Staymart and other places. Gas stations don't look anything the way they looked when I was 10 years old either. I mean, it was questionable. And you definitely didn't eat a salad or an egg salad sandwich in a gas station in 1989, right? You go there today, they're selling fresh meat. They're selling salads. They're selling tons of stuff. Casey sells more pizza than Domino's. That's incredible. So that C-store thing about being convenient, people are eating on the go, we have to tap into that market. We have to tap into that quick and easy market. Go to Costco, go to Sam's, go to retailers. Prepackaged foods, right? They're everywhere. This is way, way more than 15 years ago when we were trying to say, we got to do something to beat those rotisserie chickens, which are still a huge business in the poultry sector. But there's more than that now, right? These packaged foods are really, really important. And lastly, on the bottom of this, we've got to move away from an occasion-based meat. And we've got to move ham away from just Easter and Christmas, right? And move that into another category. And I'm going to tell you here in a second, I'm going to show you some brands, and they're just examples. They're not all the brands that we're working with. But when we talk about this collectively, we are going back to marketing in a big way on a national scale with this new Taste What Pork Can Do campaign. And I'm going to give you some examples of this in just a second. And I keep using this analogy over and over, so if you've already heard me say it, sorry. If you come to NPIC in a few weeks, I'm going to use the exact one again because you got to keep driving this into people's brains. How many of you, raise your hand, remember Blockbuster? Exactly. Okay, so Blockbuster, for those of you who didn't raise your hand, mostly the younger audience in here, is that Blockbuster was a video store company. It was in every town in America and throughout the world. They rented VHS cassettes and Blu-ray, whatever that was, and right, you returned them back to the store. And I use this example all the time about where the pork industry needs to go. And I hate to say that we're a little bit Blockbuster, but we're a little bit Blockbuster, and it's time to change that. In the year 2000, Blockbuster brought in $800 million in late fees. And that same year, this startup company called Netflix, heard of them, offered themselves to sale to Blockbuster for $50 million and got laughed out of the room saying, a mail DVD system never worked. And you know what? It didn't. It didn't work. But Netflix didn't give up. Blockbuster did. And eventually they just got pushed out of business. They were innovative disruptors at Netflix. And they quickly went from being a mail-in DVD company, then this thing called the internet was born, right? It was a pretty big deal. And they then went into selling you media, selling you subscriptions, and now they're a full-blown, probably multi-trillion dollar media company, making movies, making shows, making everything else in the world. The analogy there is, who do we want to be? You want to be Blockbuster, or you want to be Netflix. And I think that innovative disruptor thing, which I say all the time, is crucially important, because when we think about being an innovative disruptor, it means what we're doing in 2025, June of 2025, is not what's going to work in June of 2028. It's just not. The world's changing too fast. Someone asked in this panel I was on yesterday too, what do you think the implications of AI are going to be? And I'm like, I don't know. It's pretty amazing though. And it generates some pretty amazing things very quickly. I don't know what it's going to be, but I can tell you this, in 2028, there's going to be significantly less baby boomers in existence. The millennials are going to be that much older. Their kids are going to have moved on. And then the next generations, which are generation alpha and beta, right? They're going to slowly start coming into the market, and we're just going to have to be disruptive. We're going to have to think about what drives the next generation of consumer over and over again and not become stale in this process. So, how do you build a strategic approach with a very limited amount of strategic reserves? Because that's what we have. Yes, we pull in a significant amount of checkoff revenue, and I'm constantly thinking of ways that I can explain this to producers to say, how do we justify that spend? Last year, this year, we spent about $28 million. That's more money than has been spent on marketing. That's total, international and domestic, in more than a decade. Way more than a decade. And I told somebody when they said, I just don't know about that return on investment, I said, well, divide $28 million into 28 billion pounds, because the math is pretty even across there, and ask yourself that if you spent 0.001 cent for every pound to try to promote it and its values, I look at that as a pretty significant return on investment, if we're doing it right. And doing it right means making some tough decisions, and this slide really represents that. I'm going to start by saying it doesn't mean the states in gray are not important. But if you could only spend your strategic reserves in a handful of very specific places, 50% of all the consumption of pork in the United States is done in states that have no pigs. You cannot exclude California as much as you might want to, right? And there are more people between LA and Bakersfield than there are between Houston, Texas, and Fargo, who, by the way, meet the multicultural demographics I was talking about and are heavy pork users. We can't ignore them. You ignore 45 million people out of 350 million total citizens, it's a losing proposition for pork. Texas, Florida, New York, if you add that, there's another map I could show you, I don't have it on here, but if you add another layer, 80% of all pork consumption is done in 20 states. So it's about being strategic. So this is a mostly digital campaign, okay? It's not billboards, it's not magazines, that's what we used to do. Hoping that someone will buy them and then give you a metric about impressions, right? That's not a real marketing metric today. Return on investment can be calculated by spend. So we're starting to really think about this more specifically. And the initial tranche starting on May 6th of this year was really about where are the states where we can actually make a difference in terms of national marketing, and we hammered down on those states. Now, we also work individually, one-on-one with states. We do it right here in Iowa with Pat's crew. We do it with Illinois pork. We do it with Minnesota pork. We do it with a lot of other states in the heartland of pig country that are outlined right there. You know why Illinois is on that map. One population center, right? You can't ignore Chicago, you can't ignore New York City, you can't ignore Atlanta, you can't ignore Houston, Dallas metros. You just can't do it because there's too many people there who find pork to be relevant, and we've got to drive that message. What we're doing individually is still doing those strategic one-offs with states individually to drive this market forward. And again, this is a huge risk sometimes when you just put brands on a slide. This is not everyone that's included, but I want to explain how this works. So from a master brand strategy, Taste of Pork and Do is on the very top of the chart. We spent the last 2 years before we ever launched at the table with every major packer processor, every major retailer, every major food service company in this country saying, hey, we don't want to build this in a vacuum down in Clive, Iowa. We want to build this in a situation where we get buy-in from the whole business. Because if we spend $20 million, that is nothing. But if we spend 20 and every other packer spends 20, that's something, right? And this pork business has learned over the last couple of years that we need a new strategic imperative around pork because everybody's seeing that same segmentation data. So aside from building our own national brand campaign that's specifically targeting consumers and what we call a B2C, business to consumer approach, we're also working one-on-one with those packer processors, the food service companies, the retailers, every single day to be a part of their strategic blueprint. So when they're doing strategic planning, whether this is Walmart or Honey Baked Ham, how can we show them the segmentation data that says, hey, you actually do have a future, but you're going to have to think about flavors other than just a bone-in spiral ham, which nobody wants, but once a year. What about a smaller package, a pre-sliced that's Nashville hot or has honey heat? You see all those like flavor trends that are happening in the business? How can we work with them to then say, how do we carry that over? And then, very importantly, how do we work with our states? Because we have 42 state pork associations, many of them which have their own marketing and promotion directors as well. And how do we make sure that we all align the strategy? And if you look over the coming months and years, and you start looking at strategies from some of those major packers, I guarantee you 90% of the time, just think about those three non-negotiables: taste and flavor, nutrition, and versatility. You will see that coming out in those messages because we didn't want to do this in a vacuum. We want to make sure that if we're going to push, right, everybody's pushing in the same direction and we're not contradicting each other. So it's important that we brought everybody along, but it's also important that we bring those 42 state pork associations along, because the other question that we get is, okay, I hear about all these great things you're doing. Why am I not hearing about it? All right? Totally different media segment. To catch you in your radio this fall while you're combining corn costs a lot of your money to tell you about what you're doing. Okay? And you're going to hear some of that. But the question is, and I said this at MPIC last year, and I'll probably say it again this year, is that this isn't for you, it's about you. Does that make sense? If we don't focus on the consumer, going to World Pork Expo and telling people to eat more pork is a futile point. Don't need to do that, right? We need to be in New York City. We need to be in LA. We need to be in these major metros reminding people that it's nutritious and it's delicious. And we need to make sure also that we're not excluding the retailers or the food service people, because the reality of the situation is that it's like football. We do everything, and we carry the ball to the 99-yard line, and then we hand it off to those people who actually interact with our consumers to get the job done for us. And that's tricky. Whether they're trying to cook it right, don't even get me started about cooking it right, or just telling them to promote it. And that's what we do every day. Here's how you promote it. Here's how you celebrate it. And we've got lots of examples. And I say, like, in the wild, some of you saw this at World Pork Expo, maybe the Fairway trailer that was wrapped. We do some of those things for just general exposure. You saw some of the things that are happening, but it's happening. It's happening. Pork is having a moment right now. I thought that was really cool because this was Potbelly Sandwiches. You guys know Potbelly, it's a big chain. We worked very closely with them and just went through our strategic plan, the consumer segmentation with them, and they extrapolated that. Pork is having a moment, and I love that, right? Because it's an opportunity. Someone mentioned beef earlier. If you can't see an opportunity today, that there isn't a transformational opportunity for pork right now, then I don't know what you can see. Because there is one heck of an opportunity in the red meat space to gain some market share on an affordable, not cheap, protein source for consumers. And when I say it's working, I just pulled together some examples, and you guys can't see all these, obviously, but the packer adoption, the retailer adoption, this takes years, but it's happening even quicker than, quite honestly, I expected, because everybody's trying to figure out where they live in this marketplace, and they're trying to find more margin. We all live in a business of margin, right? If you run a retail store, you live in a business of margin. Food service, margin. Farming, margin. How do I take my cost of goods, sell something, and try to make a little bit of money? And these examples from food service companies, companies, from fast food companies that are trying LTOs, limited time offers, retailers, states, they're picking it up. But I do need to remind you, this takes years. This will not happen in 3 years. It will not happen in 5 years. It will take years to reverse the situation that we're in. What I like is that we started, right? And if we keep that same foot down approach that we've had on the international market domestically, we're going to get there. It will work. It's not even a question of, I think it will work. No, it will work, because we're back in that promotion space. So I'm going to show you a video, and I don't know if they can turn the lights down or not, but we created a little bit of a fun sizzle reel for the National Pork Industry Forum that I think kind of encapsulates the program itself, to just talk more specifically about what it is in a quick 2-minute video, and then we'll wrap.
Some would say we raise pigs, and we do. But what we really raise is flavor. Through centuries and generations, that flavor has made pork the cornerstone of nearly every cuisine. It's no secret that here in America, some cuts are more popular than others. Bacon, sausage, ham, pepperoni. But these are just a small taste of what pork can do, because bacon is just the beginning. From today, we're going whole hog. We're using these craveable favorites as a delicious gateway to even more flavor. To put it simply, we're going to use pork to sell more pork. We're turning that charcuterie board craving into a Wednesday night pulled pork ritual. We're making their favorite pizza topping a hankering for the perfect pork dumpling. We're taking that once-a-year holiday ham and adding a once-a-day flavor fix. Pork is no longer the other. It's flavor. Our mission is a simple one. Make pork cool and make them drool. We're going to invite everyone everywhere to raise their expectations, demand the best flavor, open their minds and mouths, and taste what pork can do.
Okay, there we are. So I'm going to finish that and say thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and also have time for some questions. So thank you very much for your attention.
Appetites are stimulated. How about questions? Any questions? Go ahead, Dr. Rademacher. One right down front.
Actually, I'm going to let my colleague ask her question.
Okay.
I'll follow up.
I'll clarify your say-do comment that you were robbing in relation to consumers doing. Gretchen mentioned that in regards to assimilating her team, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great presentation, David. Question. I heard about the vast difference, right, between consumption in Gen Z versus boomers, but why? Is it perception awareness? Is it values and beliefs? Or is it just competitive convenience?
Perception and awareness and competitive proteins. It's not awareness. By the way, when you do the segmentation, and this might surprise you, and I can follow up with any of you anytime, but when you poll these individuals, we have a huge consumer segmentation pool. Environmental sustainability, animal welfare, those things, they're at the very bottom. They're the very last thing they think about. And actually, to say it a little differently is, what they tell you is you don't have permission to talk to them about those things until you're relevant with them. So if you try to lead with that, it's very off-putting. But the fact of the matter is they just haven't been promoted to around pork. And you notice that statement that said, use pork to sell more pork? Most of those young consumers, Gen Zs and millennials, they do not know that bacon, pepperoni, ham, and sausage are pork. So you remember that thing I showed you, the reason it's fresh pork? They eat a ton of processed pork and they don't even know it. And then you tell them, like, pepperoni is pork. And they're like, oh, God, well, I love pork then. This is the greatest thing I've ever had. But no one has ever told them. They're not aware. So it's linking processed or further processed, another big debate right now, right? Language. But linking that category to what they already love and reminding them that that's actually pork that they could use and make at home.
All right, David, excellent presentation, and really appreciate touching on the dietary guidelines. I don't know if most people know, the average daily consumption recommended of pork is 54 grams. Well, what I'm wondering is, are you guys starting to see this big kick on protein, right? Because now that everybody's on Ozempic, one of the things that they're also promoting with these weight loss things is you got to be at 100, 120, 140 grams of protein, right? So by nature, that should help drive consumption. So, I start to wonder about so how much are we looking at pushing? Well, how many grams of protein per pound are we compared to beef? And then what's the cost of that, right? Because there's a lot of influencers out there that, they do a good job with beef. They're promoting beef carnivore diet such as that. But, with beef, and you're going to hear Barrett Nelson say the same thing today. Beef ain't cheap, and it ain't going to get cheap anytime soon. So there's a nice niche for pork in there too. Are you guys seeing any of the influence of that with a lot of these, shifting of, really talking about maximizing protein?
Yes, we are. So we're seeing maximizing protein. At first, everybody was scared to death of GLP-1s, right? 1 in 8 Americans is on a GLP-1. That's the stat, okay? So you got 1 in 8 people, which means, right? That means 20 people in this room are on a GLP-1. It's not a debate of whether or not that's good or bad for you. But what they're finding now is that you also can lose a lot of muscle mass, and you need a hell of a lot of protein to make that up. So we're doing this study not only on grams of protein, but on the role of fat in the diet, which I think is grossly misunderstood when you talk about saturated versus unsaturated, good versus bad, however you want to look at it. Someone has to get that science out there. We're already doing that research. And you have to do the research, because if you're going to influence this MAHA movement, and the dietary guidelines, you have to get it done. I was just thankful. I posted this Twitter feed post last week with the secretary, they asked him, well, what do you eat for breakfast? And he said, well, normally I fast, but when I do eat breakfast, I eat bacon. And I went, thank God, right? Because we are also going to have to determine what processed versus ultra processed meat, and that's a huge debate. But I think we're in a very safe spot. It's risky, right? All meat is probably at risk, but we're going to have to influence registered dietitians and get to physicians. And getting to physicians is incredibly difficult and incredibly expensive. But yes, we're doing the research.
Other questions? Right up here. Go ahead, up above, when you get to it.
Yeah, thanks for the update. Appreciate it. California is one of your 10 states that influence 50%. Where are we at since Prop 12 on not only with the Hispanic influence, but also just overall consumption, getting it back to norm?
Yeah, so our business intelligence team, Rick Smith specifically on our team, we publish monthly what we call a California dashboard, right? So we don't influence policy, you guys know that, I have to say that out loud, but we can influence research and the decisions that are made there. The reality of the situation is if you look at food service and you look at retail, they figured the supply out, but when you look at price, it's double digit up, and you look at consumption, it's double digit down. So the impact is not great, right, for consumption, but it for whatever statement I might be about to make, it's the new reality right now. And we're going to just have to live in that business right now and still focus on that targeted marketing in that area, because it still is, while that number is double digit both ways, there's still a lot of consumption. An insane amount of consumption that goes on in those states. So we can't ignore it, but the impact is real. It's real. Still cheaper than beef. Did I just say that? Gene, did you have a question?
That generational difference in consumption that you showed, does that repeat in other parts of the world?
That's a great question. So the answer to that is yes. They're seeing this the world over. So let me give you an example. This is something that it was not planned, and it's very interesting. But all of North America just launched a domestic marketing campaign. So I spoke at OPERMEX, which is the meeting of the Mexican pork producers, about 3 weeks ago. At that meeting was their surprise launch of their new national brand campaign for pork. And you know, the data they showed was eerily similar. It's, hey, we're losing a generation. Gen Zs and millennials are eating less. We've got to focus on taste and flavor, nutrition, and versatility. I think they may have watched some of our YouTube videos, but that's the point. Also, 2 weeks before that, the Canadian Pork Council launched a new national domestic marketing campaign focused on taste and flavor, nutrition, and balance. And while there's a competitive nature there, that can't hurt. Someone asked me, like, is that a bad thing? I'm like, a bad thing that everybody is throwing money at promoting pork? No, not a bad thing. So they're seeing that trend elsewhere, Gene. But now, I'll just give you an opposite opinion or an opposite approach. Is like, look at somewhere like South Korea. Average annual consumption, 76 pounds. Man, wouldn't that be great, right? I mean, pork is on fire. But also, if you've ever been to South Korea, they've met the needs of innovation, quick and easy meals, flavor, right? I mean, they've made pork incredibly relevant, and they don't want to lose that. And so we get a great market share there, but that trend is being seen elsewhere. And I already mentioned what happened in China. Gen Zs and millennials and the younger generation got skipped when ASF hit and that price was so high, and poultry has exploded. So yeah, I mean, the idea is you just can't keep your foot off the gas. I'm between you and lunch, so I'll just wrap by saying, taste what pork can do. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, David. Thank you.